Good morning. My name is Hayyim Angel. I'm the National Scholar at the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals and also teach Tanakh at Yeshiva University and other venues. Welcome to our three-part series on Megillat Kohelet. Kohelet is, or in English, helpfully translated as Ecclesiastes, is one of the most enigmatic books in Tanakh. It's very unusual, and in fact has caused a lot of concern and fear among rabbinic commentaries and modern commentaries alike. I hope in this three-part series to do three things. One is to introduce Kohelet and its general ideas and the discussion about it. Next week, hopefully, we'll look at a couple of the major themes of the book. And then, just to prove that this is relevant as ever, within the last couple of months, 4 different major books have been published on, or are about to be published on Kohelet. So with 4 totally different approaches. Among the 4 of them, it's close to 1,500 pages worth of work. It's really out of control. And one of the reasons why there's so much going on is because people are seeking meaning always, but particularly these days, I think that there is a void that Kohelet very well might help us address. So we'll take a quick peek at those 4 books, which are either just out or about to be out, to get a sense of different voices that are coming to the table with regard to Kohelet today. Okay, but first things first, we have to get to the basics, and that means going to the primary sources. There's a tremendous amount of fear regarding the book of Kohelet, and the rabbis already kicked this one off. The fact of the matter is, if it's in our Tanakh, if it's in the Bible, that means that tradition views it as divinely inspired, as eternally relevant, and as all true. That's so easy. That's a very simple, basic set of axioms that Jewish tradition has had for thousands of years, and there's no exception with regard to Kohelet. The problem is that Kohelet raises a lot of rabbinic eyebrows, so much so that the rabbis are not fully sure how to handle it. If you look at source number 1 over here, in Masechet Shabbat 30b, the sages wished to hide the book of Kohelet. The Hebrew word is lignoz over here. Lignoz, you put something in genizah if it's sacred, but you don't want it in circulation anymore. That means that they fully agree that it's sacred. The issue here is that it needs to be hidden. It needs to be put out of circulation because its words are self-contradictory. So it sounds like their problem is that there are contradictions within Kohelet. Fun fact, there are. There are many, many, many contradictions. They have long been noted, and there are different approaches to how to handle those contradictions. So the idea is, if it's divinely inspired, Kohelet should be able to make up his mind. That's what it sounds like the problem is. But then you keep on reading and you see that something else is going on. Yet, why did they not hide it? Because its beginning is religious teaching and its end is religious teaching. Okay, if you have a problem with contradictions, internal contradictions, the way you fix this is, here are the contradictions and here's how we fix it. It's really very simple. Something else is going on here, which is much bigger than that, and that's what this Talmudic passage alludes to, and other midrashic sources are more explicit about. Its beginning is religious teaching, and its end is religious teaching. It sounds like the problem is they fear that the middle of it is not otherwise religious teaching. That's different from internal contradictions. That sounds like, oh no, Kohelet, the book, sounds like it might contradict Torah teachings altogether, and that's so terrifying that they want to remove it. Okay. So there are 2 problems that we have to address. One is how Kohelet is internally contradictory, which it is. And the other one is that it seems to have ideas, which we'll talk about, which threaten the whole ideology of the Torah, in which case Kohelet can't be part of Tanakh. It cannot be part of the Bible. One thing that they never taught me in school, it took me years to figure out as an adult, and that has to do with how the Talmud and the Talmudic rabbis learn Tanakh, as opposed to how later medieval and modern commentaries learn Tanakh. I never knew this trick, but it's a good trick. If you hold up a Tanakh, I will hold one up just to make the point. So what am I holding? So if you ask any commentary, or if you ask me, what am I holding, or what was I holding a moment ago, the answer is, I am holding a library. There are 24 books that happen to be in one convenient binding, but 24 books each one has its own personality, its own ideas, and you have to understand each book in its own first, and only then do you start thinking about how that relates to any other book in Tanakh. That's normal. The Talmud does not read the Tanakh that way. It reads the Tanakh as one great big book with a ton of hyperlinks. The idea is that they don't care if one verse is connected to another verse in a passage, or if they're in totally different sections in the Bible. They will read all the Bible as one great big book that all needs to be connected. So as a result, they are threatened whenever something seems to contradict something else, even if it's very far away and has a whole different point of view and a different perspective. That's what happens with Kohelet. Another thing that the Midrash does that later Pashtanim, those who seek the plain sense of the text, don't do, is that they will atomize verses. Again, these are words 500 years ago, I don't know what I would have said instead of hyperlink or atomize. These are two words that are much more recent than that, but they're very handy words. The atomization of a text is something like this. If you look at source number 2, this is a verse toward the end of the book of Kohelet. Kohelet has 12 chapters in our printed texts. O youth, enjoy yourself while you are young. Heart lead you to enjoyment in the days of your youth. Follow the desires of your heart and the glances of your eyes, but know well that God will call you to account for all such things. Okay, when I read this verse, I don't see this as unusually problematic at all. It sounds like live life while you can and do it within the confines of God's law. Simple. You just read the whole verse as a unit, we're good. But imagine what would happen if you atomize the text and you read it like this. Let's say I just block off one thing and ignore anything else. Follow the desire of your hearts, the desires of your heart, and the glances of your eyes. Let's say I just read that. Wow, here's a divinely inspired verse telling me that I could do whatever I want. I'm telling you, you could do whatever you want. Okay, so the Pashtan, somebody seeking the plain sense of the text would say, relax, you have to read the whole verse. And not only do you have to read the whole verse, you need to read that verse in the context of the chapter, the passage, the book, right? That's what Pshat is. Pshat is finding the meaning of a text with its words, but also its surrounding context. But imagine if you atomize and just read that. Oh my goodness, this sounds like a disaster. Kohelet is a divinely inspired text telling us we can do whatever we want to do, follow the desires of our hearts and the glances of our eyes. So if you understand how Midrash thinks, you can appreciate why the sages of the Talmud were unusually ruffled by Kohelet, because there are plenty of verses where you could do stuff like this, right? So the simple solution to that is, okay, read the book, read the whole book in its context. You won't have these problems. But the Midrash reads it that way, and so you can appreciate source number 3. Here's an ancient Midrash in Vayikra Rabbah, source 3. Rabbi Benjamin ben Levi stated, the sages wanted to store away the book of Kohelet since they found in it ideas that leaned towards heresy. Okay, now we're talking. This is what the source number 1 was alluding to but didn't get to. This is what it's about. They found ideas in it that leaned toward heresy. They argued, was it right that Shlomo should have said the following, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth? Moshe said, go not about after your heart in your own eyes. That's in the 3rd paragraph of the Shema. But Shlomo said, walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. What then? Is all restraint to be removed? Voila, there's atomization for you. Right here they are asking a question as though they're oblivious to the second half of that verse. So they see a verse like this and they're like, oh my goodness, this is terrible. Shlomo seems to be saying, do whatever you want to do. Is there neither justice nor judge? When, however, he said, but know thou, that for all these things God will bring you into judgment, they admitted that Shlomo had spoken well. Oh, thank God, there's another part of the verse. It's all cool now. So finally, after freaking out in the first half, they then come around to the second half and realize, oh, he's saying, enjoy life while you can, but enjoy life in the context of God's law, that it's not a free-for-all. Okay, so this is a good illustration of why the sages of the Talmud were unusually bothered by Kohelet, because you could take individual verses out of context and come up with a very nihilistic, hedonistic point of view. And so they were fearful that people would actually read the text that way and walk away less religious than they were before they opened the book. And that's a disaster. The whole point of this is to grow closer to God, grow deeper in your faith, grow deeper in your religious experience. That's the point of learning any Tanakh or any sacred text in Jewish tradition. If you can't do that, there's a problem. Okay, so that's the world of Midrash. So the Midrash thankfully decided after whatever deliberations they had, they're going to keep Kohelet in Tanakh after all, and they're going to radically reinterpret it. If you go through the various Midrashic collections on Kohelet, you almost can't believe that they're interpreting the text of Kohelet. If you just read Kohelet alone without the Midrashic overlay, it sounds very troubling and very troubled at times, and certainly one that is going to raise a lot of questions without answering them. If you read the Midrash, it's all about don't worry, study Torah, observe the Torah, be close to God, and it feels a lot calmer. So I appreciate that. What the Midrash is often trying to do is to harmonize Kohelet with all the rest of the books of Tanakh. But then the challenge comes up. Let's say you just want to understand Kohelet in its own context. So that's what later Mefarshim do. Later commentaries, we call them Pashtanim. Let's write the word. Pashtanim are people who pursue what's called the Pshat. Pshat, again, is defined as the plain sense of the text, or really a better translation is the primary original intent of the author, based on the text and the context of the verse. So that's what you're looking for in this. The question is, can you do that with Kohelet? And here you find something fascinating. If you survey the traditional commentaries, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Rashbam, Sforno, many others, you find that many of them deviate from the plain sense of the text way more than usual because they're stuck with the paradox. On the one hand, they are scholars and they're trying to pursue the truth. On the other hand, they are great rabbis who are trying to get us closer to God. Like the sages of the Midrash, many of these commentaries feel that there's a fundamental problem, that in fact, Kohelet does present verses that seem to be contra our religious system. And as a result, they worry about it. So they come up with different strategies of how to deal with that. Example, if you look at Kohelet 1:18, it's the very end of chapter 1. For as wisdom grows, vexation grows. To increase learning is to increase heartache. If you look at the context, you don't ever need to believe me, but if you look up chapter 1, you will see Kohelet presents himself as the wisest man of all time. He's the persona of King Solomon. He's Shlomo HaMelech. And he's evaluating the lasting worth of wisdom and wealth, which are two things that he excelled at. So wisdom, if you read through the rest of Tanakh, the usual strategy is the more wisdom you have, the better it is. The happier you are, the more successful of a life you're going to live, the better decisions you'll make, all the good stuff. Kohelet never challenges that point, but he certainly exposes the weaknesses of both wise people and wisdom. So for example, here he says, as wisdom grows, vexation grows. To increase learning is to increase heartache. Sounds like this is the opposite of ignorance is bliss. Okay. And he never backs away from this sort of teaching. He definitely acknowledges that the wiser you are, the more you are wary of life's problems, and the more you realize these are real problems. Okay. I'm fine with that verse as it stands. Most commentaries are also. But Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, write down the name so we can introduce the cast of characters. He lived in the 16th century Italy. He is so bothered by that verse as it stands that he says it can't possibly mean what I just told you it means, because that would be saying that there's a weakness to wisdom, and wisdom is all good. So it must be that when it says as wisdom grows, vexation grows, that refers to the wisdom of heretics. Not true wisdom, because true wisdom would only make you happier and better, but the wisdom of heretics could confuse you, could lead you astray, all these terrible things. Okay, so Rabbi Ovadia Sforno is doing something that I like to refer to as radical reinterpretation of Kohelet. When I say radical reinterpretation, what I mean is this. Commentaries debate everything. That's what makes the learning Torah always great. Right? One of the things we focus on at the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals is just the diversity of legitimate views and how they can't stifle one another. It's very important to hear different voices and find different avenues into tradition. Radical reinterpretation, so when there's a debate, that's a healthy thing. When there's radical reinterpretation, that means that you're saying, the sacred text is so troubling, I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist or make it mean something that it clearly does not mean. That's radical reinterpretation. So Rabbi Ovadia Sforno is doing that here. Kohelet is not talking about the wisdom of heretics, not here, not anywhere in his book. He's talking about real wisdom. And he's saying that wisdom, while it is a good thing and obviously must be pursued, comes with many shortcomings that you weren't expecting. This is one of them, that if you are wiser, you very often are cognizant of life's difficulties and troubles and things that don't go away. And so that could trouble you also. There's nothing bad about that, but it's something that Rabbi Sforno was so concerned about that he simply nixed the verse as it stood and radically reinterpreted. If you go through the traditional commentaries on Kohelet, you will find this sort of strategy happening a lot. We're not talking about where there's a legitimate debate over what a verse might mean. We're talking about where it's clear what the verse means, but certain rabbis are comfortable with that and explain it in its context, and others are simply not. Okay, so that's strategy A. Strategy B, which is championed by somebody like Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra. Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra lived in 12th century Spain, and then he ended up traveling to many different countries. He did not remain in Spain. It's in Italy, France, even in England. He had a very difficult life and wasn't always, he wasn't a world traveler who was wealthy and wanted to see the world. He was fleeing from country to country, he had many woes. He wrote some great poetry, including one where he said, if I were a gravedigger, nobody would die. He felt like a total failure. So he wrote poems about what a woeful and difficult life he lived and things like that. So Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra, who remains one of the greatest commentaries ever of the Bible, and certainly the parts that he wrote on, he has a different strategy because he doesn't like radical reinterpretation. So his strategy is something like this. Let's say you come to a passage like source number 5. Go, eat your bread in gladness, drink your wine in joy, for your action was long ago approved by God. Let your clothes always be freshly washed, and your head never lack ointment. Enjoy happiness with the woman you love all the fleeting days of life that have been granted to you under the sun, all your fleeting days. For that alone is what you can get out of life and out of the means you acquire under the sun. I don't know about you, this sounds great. It sounds like some life-affirming verses, which Kohelet has many of, saying, look, we're all going to die one day. Life is limited. Wisdom is limited. Wealth doesn't last. But still, every minute that we live is a blessing, and we should maximize benefit from this world in contentment and fulfilling God's word. That's the running theme in Kohelet. That's what these verses say too, and these are hardly alone within Kohelet. But if you read these in a vacuum, it just sounds like, okay, since we're going to die, and since we can't understand the universe, and since we can't understand God anyway, go out there and party. You could read these verses in a vacuum that way. If you read all of Kohelet, I don't think you would read Kohelet that way. But if you just read these verses atomized, that's what it sounds like. Okay, so Ibn Ezra doesn't like that. So he's not going to radically reinterpret these verses. They say what they say. The Hebrew is clear, the context is clear. So he just says in source number 6, this is the folly that people say in their hearts. In other words, Kohelet is quoting idiots. He's not speaking for himself. He's quoting fools who draw the wrong conclusions, but then he disagrees with them. So this is a classic strategy that Ibn Ezra uses when he's uncomfortable with a verse, but he doesn't see any other way to read the Hebrew. Right? The Hebrew says what it says. The English translation is perfectly good in this case. And that's it. So Ibn Ezra knows there's nothing further to do with the words. So he simply imagines a speaker that is not in the text. And he does that a lot. That's his running strategy. And you should know that to this day, there are those who still use this strategy. And even though Kohelet does not signal to us, hi, everybody, I'm quoting somebody else, like fools or other sages or somebody else, sounds like Kohelet is speaking for himself. But all the same, there are those who, for this or that discomfort, ascribe various passages of Kohelet to different speakers that are not Kohelet's voice. So I find this sort of approach terribly unsatisfying, just because, again, it seems arbitrary. It sounds like it gives all the power to the commentary. One of my standard strategies of learning, which is just the strategy of any real Pashtan, is you're not allowed to tell the text what to say. You have to interpret the text. We don't always know what the text says. That's why there's always debate. But once everybody agrees that this is what the text says, then we're done. Right? The second you can tell the text, no, you're not allowed to say that, that's a problem. So strategies of radical reinterpretation or strategies of, oh, let's just invent a speaker, both fall short of letting the text speak for itself. So in order to go about understanding the heart of Kohelet, we can't censor the book, which thankfully our sages did not do. We can't radically reinterpret the book because that simply means that you're saying that the text is not allowed to say what it's saying, and you're not allowed to ascribe it to other speakers unless Kohelet explicitly says, hi, everybody, I'm quoting somebody else, be it some sage, be it some fool, whoever it is. Until you hear that in the text, then you have to assume that Kohelet is speaking for himself, and you have to take it seriously. You can't shrug it off by saying, oh, he's quoting fools. Okay, so those are those strategies which, again, are very commonplace within classical commentary and in different ways in modern commentary as well. So you got to reject all of that, in my opinion. Okay, then one other thing that has to be talked about is the problem of contradictions. So Ibn Ezra fell prey to Aristotelian thought. It's not his fault. In the 12th century, Aristotle was all the rage, and if you read him, you believe that this was the way to think. So Ibn Ezra writes, usually he's very brief actually, but on 7.3, I just gave you a tiny, whiny little excerpt, but it's huge. Ibn Ezra has a massive discussion over there where he is concerned about contradictions. So he says as follows: one sees in Solomon's words in this book difficult matters. In many places, he says one thing and then it's opposite. This is true. He really does contradict himself a lot. For this reason, our sages said that the sages wanted to hide Kohelet because his words contradict themselves. We saw that in source number 1, and there are plenty of midrashic parallels. It is known that the greatest lightweight among the wise would not compose a book and contradict himself in that book. So his point is, if a lightweight would not contradict himself, certainly not Kohelet, the wisest of all men. It's a good argument, except it's actually, sorry to say, imposing Aristotelian thought onto Tanakh. It's a mistaken assumption because Tanakh doesn't work the way that Aristotle works. It's not an insult to Aristotle even. They're just different ways to think, and it's important not to impose one system of thought onto another. In the case of Tanakh, not just in Kohelet, in all of Tanakh, there are loads of contradictions. And so what commentaries such as Ibn Ezra don't ask, and this is the problem, they come up with a whole battery. What he does in his very lengthy comment, and many, many commentaries follow suit, is he comes up with a battery of strategies of how to solve every single one of the contradictions. But what all of these commentaries are missing is a much more fundamental question. Why is Kohelet making us work so hard? Very nice to come up with all these strategies to resolve contradictions, to harmonize them, to fix this one, to fix that one. But if Kohelet wanted to, he could have just not made all these contradictions in the first place. So we have to ask a more basic question, which is, why are there so many contradictions? Not how do you fix them once you have them. Ibn Ezra is addressing the reality. There are many, let's fix them. But he's not addressing the question of, but why should they be there in the first place? Why is Kohelet contradicting himself so much, forcing us to come up with all these strategies? So Rabbi Soloveitchik, who was quite aware of Aristotelian thought and was also quite aware of biblical and halachic thought, simply says there are two different ways of thinking, and this seems to line up again, not only with regard to Kohelet, but just in general. Rabbi Soloveitchik says this in a book called Days of Deliverance, which is one of many books that has been published since his passing in 1993, put together by his students. Okay, so that's what this is. Judaism has never accepted the two-value Aristotelian logic, which, in its principle of contradiction and the excluded middle, states that if A contradicts B, then only one of them is right and the other is wrong. The thing is either B or A, to the exclusion of being either both together or being neither A nor B. Judaism has ignored this principle and has quite often acted as if both A and B are right, in spite of their mutual exclusiveness. Even in the halachic realm, Judaism believes that there is a possibility for a contradiction in the objects without negating either of them. Jewish philosophy and the metaphysic of man can only be understood if the dialectical principle is adopted as the point of departure. Spot on, not that he needs my approval, but Kohelet, this speaks to what Kohelet is doing. Kohelet is willing to present a lot of contradictions, perhaps because reality is contradictory. Human experience is very complex. It's contradictory. We often experience, any one of us, experiences different emotions and different realities at any given time, and very complex realities. Tanakh speaks to that. It's not a systematic theology, but it's trying to create one systematic, consistent point of view. That's what Aristotelian thought at least tries to do, and what great medieval philosophers tried to emulate. Tanakh isn't that at all. Tanakh is a whole battery of reflections, divinely inspired reflections, getting us closer to God. And if Kohelet is going to try to bring us closer to God through human experience, you better believe there will be a lot of contradictions. Okay, so to summarize, here are strategies that are not going to work in Kohelet, and they have been proven over thousands of years not to solve the problem. One is radical reinterpretation. One is ascription of passages that you don't like to a fictional speaker. And one is trying to solve and harmonize all the contradictions when they're patently there. So that's part A of the shiur. Simply to summarize 2,000 years of scholarship, that's what I just did, on Kohelet, trying to sort through, here are some common trends that you see time and again, and trends that don't really fully work. So if you want to go about learning Kohelet, you have to try to understand, let's hear Kohelet's voice with all of his contradictions and with all of his bluntness, and don't radically reinterpret or try to shove off whatever ideas you don't like to some other speaker. So how are we going to build the foundation for that? Well, we can go back to an ancient source, back to the time of the Tanaim, like first, second century CE, Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe on source number 9. Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe said in the Tosefta Yadayim, the Song of Songs defiles the hands because it was composed with divine inspiration. Kohelet does not defile the hands because it is only Solomon's wisdom. The radical stuff you don't hear anymore. Here you have one of the Tanaim in a Tosefta, a very authoritative ancient source, saying that Kohelet is not divinely inspired at all. So for the record, tradition does not accept this. Tradition accepts that Kohelet very much is divinely inspired. And for that matter, on a halachic level, it also defiles the hands, just like any other book in Tanakh. What matters is what Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe is saying, because he actually has the heart of what makes Kohelet different from the other 23 books that appear in our Tanakh. If you read Kohelet, you will find something staggering about it. You could have written it. You wouldn't do as good a job, neither would I. But any one of us could have written it because it is absolutely human. There is no privileged prophetic wisdom or knowledge. There is no traditional knowledge that you and I can't have also. He's simply describing the human experience. And this human experience is true at the time of the author of Kohelet, and this human experience is true now, and it has always been true and always will be true until the Mashiach comes. Now, Shimon ben Menashe is saying that at the heart of Kohelet, it is just it's even if it's divinely inspired according to tradition, it is an absolutely human perspective. So much so that that's what makes it so shocking to read it within the context of Tanakh. If I read Aristotle, okay, here's a wise sage trying to grapple with the truths of the universe. And I know that he's a human being. He could be right, he could be wrong. And I have my prophetic tradition, divinely inspired and revealed from God as a Jew. And those are simply different realms. But when you read Kohelet in Tanakh, I expect some kind of prophecy or some kind of, okay, he has privileged information that I don't have. Just like when I read the book of Isaiah or the book of Exodus, whatever it is. Here you have divinely revealed wisdom, divinely revealed teaching. Not so Kohelet. Kohelet is a purely human book. Here's some facts about Kohelet. There's an expression, Tachar HaShemesh, under the sun. This goes back to my baseball days. I used to like statistics in baseball. And L'Havdil, I find that statistics in Tanakh are even more useful because you really get a sense of that. This expression, Tachar HaShemesh, or under the sun, appears in Kohelet 29 times. Under the sun means in human experience. In the other 23 books of the Bible, Tachar HaShemesh appears a grand total of 0 times. Okay, so that becomes very meaningful. Kohelet is saying, hello, everybody, dear reader. I'm presenting a perspective that's simply different. I'm speaking totally and exclusively under the sun. I'm not talking about revelation. I'm not talking about the Torah. I'm not talking about the God-Israel relationship. I'm just talking about human beings and what our experience is. There's another parallel expression, Tachat HaShamayim, or under the heavens, that appears 3 more times. So we have a total of 32 of these expressions in Kohelet and 0 of those in the whole rest of the Bible. So that's statistic number 1. Statistic number 2, you have this word Adam, not in terms of Adam, the person. Adam simply means humankind. That term appears in Kohelet 49 times. So what he's telling us here is, I'm describing people, not Jews, not prophets, not angels, but not even Jews. It's not about the people of Israel. The people of Israel are irrelevant to Kohelet. I'm talking about human experience under the sun. This affects everybody on the planet, Jew or non-Jew, alike. This is simply our shared experience. Okay, that's also very helpful. The word Torah appears in Kohelet a grand total of 0 times, whereas Chokhmah, or wisdom, and Yirat Shamayim, or Yirat Elohim, fear of God, they appear a lot. Because it's a universal wisdom and it's universal fear of God. God belongs to all human beings. But it's not about our unique covenantal relationship with God. Other books in Tanakh cover that just fine, but not Kohelet. Kohelet is about the universal human experience and our relationship with other people and our relationship with God. Okay, another statistic, God has 2 primary names in Tanakh. One is what we call the Shem Havaya, or the Tetragrammaton. That's Yud, then Hey, then Vav, then Hey. That's God's personal name in Tanakh. That appears in Kohelet a grand total of 0 times. And then you have a more generic name, Elohim, which means God, but in the sense of it's not a name, it's a noun. That appears 40 times in Kohelet. Kohelet is the only book that has Elohim and not Shem Havaya, actually in all of Tanakh. And the idea is that God in Kohelet is very distant. We're not praying to him, we're talking about him. God is there, we think about God, we relate to God, but it's not a direct relationship in Kohelet. If you want the direct relationship, read other books of Tanakh. That's where you get that. Kohelet is simply a man's reflections on our relationship with God. There's a great academic scholar on Kohelet, my personal favorite academic scholar, I would even say. His name is Michael V. Fox. He's written a few things on Kohelet that I find very appealing. He's really taught me a lot through his writings. So Michael V. Fox raises a really interesting distinction between a parallel book in Tanakh, which is the book of Proverbs or Mishlei, which is also wisdom, biblical wisdom, and Kohelet. He says, if you ask the author of Proverbs, how do you know what you know? He would say, well, my teacher taught me, and his teacher taught him. You get the sense of this is a profound chain of tradition. Whereas if you ask Kohelet, how do you know what you know? He would say, well, 2 things. My teachers taught me, I have wisdom that is received, but my eyes are open. And my experience doesn't match what my teachers taught me. And that's what makes Kohelet stand out, not only from prophetically revealed books, but even from other biblical wisdom. Biblical wisdom typically is very wise, and it tells you that if you are wise, which includes being righteous, you will always make the right choices, and you will always live a better life. Kohelet says, I believe that, it's just that it's not true, right? Wise people sometimes don't make the right decisions. Wise people do not know everything. And wise people might live a miserable life. And fools might live a really wonderful life. If you ask the author of Proverbs, what should happen? Well, the fools their life will end up in decay. They'll get destroyed because they're making foolish decisions and they will pay the price for that. And righteous people will do great. But then Kohelet says, yes, that may be true sometimes, but it's certainly not true all the time. And as long as it's not true all the time, that's really frustrating because my teachings tell me one thing. I've received the wisdom tradition from our people, but on the other hand, it's just not like that all the time. So that's where Kohelet is different from not only prophetic revelation books, which are most of the books in Tanakh, but even from a wisdom book like Proverbs. If you want to just see how this plays out, if you look at source number 10, keep your mouth from being rash and let not your throat be quick to bring forth speech before God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth. That is why your words should be few. In other words, don't bother complaining to God about the state of the world. You don't know what you're talking about. God is up there, you're down here, so stay out of it. This is a good example of Kohelet talks about prayer. He talks about God, but he never talks to God. This is not a prayer. If you open up the book of Psalms, okay, here are people talking to God. They're petitioning God. They're protesting things. They're praising God. There's a whole bunch of different genres in the book of Psalms. Kohelet's position is God is up there, we're down here. Complaining won't do you any good. So if you read the book of Job and you hear Job just kicking and screaming and protesting God's policies for all of his suffering, even though he's righteous, Kohelet would say, look, you might be right. There are righteous people who suffer. You might be one of them. But be quiet. You're making way too much noise and you're complaining too much. God is up there and you're down here. You simply don't know. He's never going to answer Job's protests, but he's also not going to protest. He's simply going to complain about it. That's what he does. Here's another good example. If you look at source 11, Kohelet complains about a lot of things. One of them is human oppression. I further observed in source 11 here, I further observed all the oppression that goes on under the sun, the tears of the oppressed with none to comfort them, and the power of their oppressors with none to comfort them. Then I counted those who died long since more fortunate than those who are still living. It's better to have died already and not have to see this. And even better, happier than either are those who have not yet come into being and have never witnessed the miseries that go on under the sun. People who have already died at least once did witness oppression, because there's always going to be oppression until the Messianic era. Okay, so better not to have lived at all. Now, Kohelet says all kinds of things that sound like this. And what's amazing is to read it in its biblical context. Now, if you ask Abraham, well, what do you think about the oppression in the world? He would say, God, what are you doing? Abraham has a relationship with Hashem, with God. He would complain to Hashem about this. If you ask the prophet Isaiah, what do you think about all the oppression in the world? He would say, oppression, that's terrible. And he would troop right into the palace or right into the marketplace and let everybody have it and say, we need to fix this. Prophetic tradition doesn't just sit back and complain. Prophetic tradition says we have to petition God and we have to protest in our society. We can't allow oppression to happen. And if we do, that's on us too. Kohelet simply says, this is the way of the world. It stinks. Better not to see it at all. Better not to have lived at all. But this is a purely human, non-transcendent perspective. So it doesn't contradict other books in Tanakh. It's simply written from a totally different vantage point. From a purely human point of view, Kohelet describes the world as, this is simply the way it is. Read any history book and you will see. Read any media outlet. I don't care what perspective or slant you like. There's still oppression in the world. There's still violence. There's still terrible things going on. So Kohelet says, this is simply the way of the world. Whereas the prophetic tradition would say, it doesn't have to be this way. Kohelet can never have a Mashiach. He can never have a messianic era. For him, this is a permanent part of the human condition. Whereas prophets will say, we're not going to rest until we change that condition. But that requires people to be better. So this is why Kohelet is so different. If you're writing from an absolutely non-transcendent human point of view, well, then that's what you get. This is the way that it is. Kohelet is not describing a foreign reality. This is a reality that we all see. And no matter when we lived or where we lived, we would see the same, we would see this reality. That's what Kohelet is describing. Okay, Kohelet then also focuses on a rather basic point, which is everybody dies, including animals for that matter, but he's more bothered by wise people die and fools die. So what is our enduring worth? That's a question which is simply true, right? In other words, that's a good question. He's not describing something that is untrue to the human experience. That is true. And so he's very troubled by this. Well, what's the point of wealth if at one point you die and then you don't have it anymore? And even wisdom, one point you die and then you don't have it anymore. And I remember years and years and years ago, somebody was trying to inspire different people in my community, and I was one of those people she was trying to inspire. So she asked me, how do you want to be remembered in 120 years? I think that's a question which, I've read Kohelet too many times. So she was expecting, okay, you're going to come up with whatever your legacy is. I said, I don't expect anybody to remember me in 120 years. That's way too far off in the distance. I wouldn't expect great-great-grandchildren to remember very much about me at all, let alone anybody else. And that's fine, because there's meaning in the world the way that we have meaning in the world that we live in now, and we can make a difference now. That doesn't mean you're remembered in 120 years. Most people are not. Most people are forgotten in history immediately, let alone 120 years or more after that. That's where Kohelet is trying to steer us. Kohelet is saying it's not about being immortal. It's about living the best life you could live as a blessing now. That's what Kohelet is trying to do, to drive us to that. So what Kohelet does is he expresses frustrations over everything. He says in source 12, for example, here is a frustration that occurs in the world. Sometimes an upright man is requited according to the conduct of the scoundrel. Sometimes the scoundrel is requited according to the conduct of the upright. Okay, that's just the basic problem which the Torah created. The problem of unfairness is not a new problem. It's one that, as long as you believe in one God who is all good and there's providence, then the fact that there's any one person righteous person who suffers, or any one wicked person who prospers, you got a problem. It shouldn't be that way. Okay, so this is the age-old problem that the Bible created. It solved or addressed every other question, but not this one. This is the one it created. If you're a pagan, if there's evil in the world, so what? It's just gods are busy battling each other, or demons are fighting things. It's forces beyond our control. But in Tanakh, there are no other competing gods or demons or any of that stuff. It's all God, and God is all powerful, and God is fair, and God is good. That's why we have this problem and nobody else does. Only a good radical monotheist has this problem. So Kohelet raises, this is just an age-old problem. I say all that is frustration. That's a very brave thing to say. If you read other biblical books, there are approaches to this. Either you pretend that there really are no exceptions, or the much more basic understanding of it is say that you're right, it might be unfair now, but if you wait, it will all even out. The righteous person might suffer today, but he'll be cured tomorrow and do well. And the wicked person might be prospering today, but before he dies, let me tell you, going down the tubes. That's a standard approach in the book of Psalms.
No, you need Ramaba. Not enough.
It's a standard approach in Proverbs. It's a standard approach in many biblical books. Kohelet says, yeah, but it's just not true. There are exceptions to that as well. So it won't satisfy him. I therefore praised enjoyment, for the only good a man can have under the sun is to eat and drink and enjoy himself. That much can accompany him in exchange for his wealth through the days of his life that God has granted him under the sun. Kohelet's point is, look, wisdom has its limitations. I'm the wisest of all time, he says. I don't understand this problem, and I'm not going to understand this problem, and neither are you, and neither is anybody. So whenever anybody has a solution to this problem, I just say, Kohelet has none, and tradition has no good one, so you don't have one either. That's Kohelet's point. I thought about this, he says, I've lost sleep over it, and I have no solutions for you, but I can give you a response, which is, yes, there are many unsolvable frustrations and many limitations, but every day is a blessing. And that's something that Kohelet steers us to, which I think is just wonderful. Kohelet attacks an attitude which is very prevalent in our day and age, and I'm sure it's been prevalent in the past. If you read the book of Proverbs, it's very straightforward. You have two tasks: live a good, wise, righteous life, and work hard. Don't be lazy. Mishlei is very big on those things. And if you do those things, then you will have a prosperous, successful life. Kohelet says wisdom is a great value and diligence is a great value. We should do those things, but there are no guarantees. The reality is people might work very hard and fail or suffer. People might be very wise and righteous and suffer. And then people might be lazy or wicked and do great. It doesn't always work out the way it's supposed to, according to received wisdom. So he doesn't say, therefore, give up. He just says, therefore, don't feel like you're entitled. He says, if you have a day of blessing, it's a blessing from God. Be thankful to God and go enjoy that. Don't say, I deserve it. Kohelet says there's nothing that we can deserve. Our job is to do our job, but there's no necessary outcome to our hard work, both in being religious nor in being diligent. But we can accept God's blessings and be grateful for that. That's something which Kohelet says as a refrain time and again. So that's what Kohelet is about. Kohelet focuses on the absolute limitations of human experience, which we cannot solve. They're simply true. Everybody's going to die. Wisdom can't know everything. Human wisdom cannot know everything. Wise people cannot know everything. Wise people do not necessarily live a better life than fools, but we can treat wisdom and diligence as values and do those things. Then we can fear God more, be humbler, and enjoy every day of life as a blessing. That's where Kohelet goes. It's an amazing book in that regard. So by doing that, there's nothing that you have to run away from in the book. Every verse speaks for itself and actually encapsulates the message of the book. If I had to make a bumper sticker for Kohelet, I personally would draw from source number 13 over here. Hold on one second. A further word. This is in the appendix of the book, the very, very end. Because Kohelet was a sage, he continued to instruct the people. He listened to and tested the soundness of many maxims. So in Hebrew, it's izain v'chiker. Izain means to listen, like ozen. So that reflects what he does in our book, which is he has complete mastery of received wisdom tradition. But he also is chiker. He also is critical-minded about it. He doesn't simply accept wisdom. He challenges every single assumption because human experience doesn't match all of our received wisdom. It simply does not. So that's what my bumper sticker would be. If I had to make a bumper sticker for Kohelet, I would call it izain v'chiker. Listen to and test it. He does both of those things the entire book. He never relinquishes wisdom. He sticks to it. He clings to it. He is a sage. He wants us to be wise. He considers that the most desirable pursuit, but he knows that wisdom is a lot more limited than what the book of Proverbs sets it out to be. And that frustrates him, and that challenges him, and it also challenges us. So because Kohelet is written from an absolutely human perspective, on the one hand, it's very threatening to revealed religion. Like, our biblical faith is predicated on revelation. God revealed himself at Mount Sinai to Moshe and to the people of Israel, and God revealed himself through the prophets. Prophetic revelation is very, very different sounding from anything you find in Kohelet. So much so that the sages considered banning this book. But then they decided to keep it. And one of the reasons they may have decided to keep it is precisely because it is so different. It ascribes sanctity to the human perspective. So there's this wonderful midrash that if the midrash didn't say it, I would never have the nerve to say something like this. But I'm glad the midrash says it because it really speaks to what Kohelet does. It's in source number 14. He pondered the words of the Torah and investigated the meaning of the words. This is Izain Bechikir. This is my bumper sticker. He made handles to the Torah. So ozen refers to an ear, but it also refers to a handle, like on a shopping bag or a basket. Said Rabbi Nachman, imagine a large palace with many doors, so that whoever entered could not find his way back to the door. So one clever person came and took a coil of string and hung it up on the way to the door, so that all went in and out by means of the coil. So the Midrash is describing the genius who invented what you and I call the exit sign, right? Like, here you have this labyrinthine palace with so many hallways and twists and turns, and once you're in, you just can't find your way out. Okay, so some genius invented exit. So that's the parable. So what is he trying to say? So till Solomon arose, no one was able to understand properly the words of the Torah, but as soon as Solomon arose, all began to comprehend the Torah. That's an amazing sentence. The idea that nobody understood the Torah till King Solomon came along. I mean, I don't know, didn't Joshua understand it okay? Didn't the sages throughout all the ages understand it just fine? How about the prophets? How about King David? There are plenty of people before Solomon who I imagine had a decent sense, even an excellent sense, of what the Torah was about. So what's this midrash coming along and saying that King Solomon fixed things that now everybody can understand the Torah? Or the other example given, Rabbi Yosef said, imagine a big basket full of produce without any handle. So I could not be lifted. It's very awkward to lift a heavy basket of fruit without handles. Till one clever man came and made handles to it, and then it began to be carried by the handles. So till Solomon arose, no one could properly understand the words of the Torah. When Solomon arose, all began to comprehend the Torah. So I think that this midrash has its finger on something of vital importance. It's really very amazing. There are two books ascribed to King Solomon that are relevant to this conversation. One is the Song of Songs, where this midrash is in a collection of midrashim on the Song of Songs. And the other one is Kohelet, what we're discussing right now. It goes like this. The Torah commands us, for example, that we have to love God. It's in the Shema. We say it all the time. Great. And we have revelation. The whole heart and soul of what Judaism is about is revealed religion. God revealed himself to all of our people. And now we are bound by that covenant at Sinai. All good and all central. You can't have Judaism without those points. Okay, but Kohelet, or King Solomon, addresses the following reality. How about you and me? We're not prophets. How do we love God? How do we connect to that world of revelation if we can't experience revelation because we are not prophets? So the voice of the Torah is saying, here's God's voice, the revealed voice of God. Here's the book of Isaiah. Here's the revealed voice of God through the prophet. So King Solomon says, that's all great. And in fact, it's essential to who we are. But it's not enough. How do we experience that if we're not that? So King Solomon wrote two books of vital importance to the entire biblical tapestry. One is the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs is a very tender love poem describing the love between a human man and a human woman. But from time immemorial, Jewish tradition understood that to be the love of Israel and God, or the love of one righteous person and God. From time immemorial, that's how we've understood it. This midrash espouses that view, that the real meaning of the Song of Songs has to do with God and Israel, but it's saying like this: we can't understand the love of God and Israel because we're just puny mortals. We're just people who are not prophets. But we can understand human love. And if we understand human love, then we can begin to approach what it means to love God. So King Solomon says there's a need. If you just have revealed books in Tanakh, then us regular folk who are not prophets would never be able to understand fully how do we connect to this world. We're simply not prophets. We're not privy to that divine layer of inspiration. Okay, but we are privy to human love. Okay, let's have a book about human love and translate that to the love between God and Israel. That's something that we can relate to and understand. And Kohelet is the philosophy part of that. How in the world are we supposed to understand biblical wisdom and revelation if our experience doesn't match that? The answer is, I'm going to write a book that matches human experience and teaches people who live as human beings how to connect to the worlds of biblical wisdom and prophecy. You need Kohelet in Tanakh. Kohelet is wildly different from any book of Revelation. It's even different from received wisdom because it brings in human experience. That's precisely what enables us to connect to not only Kohelet, but to the other books. If you just read the book of Proverbs, you'll say, it's not always true. I see with my own eyes a different reality. Kohelet speaks to the reality that you and I see. There's no privileged wisdom in it. You and I see this every day. We know everything that he says to be true. And that's precisely the whole that Kohelet came to fill. Hi, the human perspective is sacred too. And because our sages incorporated Kohelet into Tanakh, you and I and any thoughtful person whose experience of just the world around us is different from the world of revelation, and it's even different from the pure teachings of wisdom, suddenly we can connect to the biblical tradition. It's something which it really opens up. And so I'm very grateful that the sages did not banish Kohelet, because otherwise I wouldn't even know it existed, and neither would you. I'm glad that radical reinterpretation doesn't take away what the words mean. You can just read the book yourself and you'll see that's what Kohelet is trying to do. And that opens up worlds of, wow, that's the world that we inhabit. And now we can try to connect to God and the Torah better, specifically through the lens of wisdom/human experience. Okay, that ends my discourse for the day. We have a few minutes left for questions, answers, comments, and then we'll call it a day until next week.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. This is Irene from England. How are you?
Hi, Irene. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's very interesting, especially on Ibn Ezra, of course, which I've written a book about, and he died in England.
You're a fan, I know.
Yeah, I know, but it wasn't on the commentary on Kohelet, although he wrote that very similar time to his commentary on Tanakh, which I do know. I don't want to say you're unfair to him, because everything you say is true. All I will plead is that living in Spain, then Italy, France, and England in the 12th century is very different from living in America with all its, I know you've got problems as well with anti-Semitism in the 21st century. And, I think he's such a great guy, and his understanding of Torah so amazing, and his definition of pshat, which is in my book, of course I might be wrong, is so different than most other people. I'm not sure he can just be dismissed as an Aristotelian, in my view, at any rate. I can see what you're saying. I mean, Rabbi Soloveitchik, who of course became American, you could just say he's like Isaiah Berlin, which is the 20th century approach of you can have two contradictory things together. And because we live now in a world where to a lot of people, there's no such thing as right and wrong that are absolutely or good or bad or whatever, and everything is in flux. I just don't know. I'll have to reconsider. You've made me think. Anyway, it's a fantastic course, and thank you very much. Looking forward to next week.
Respond to that, by the way. I don't think that Rabbi Soloveitchik intends to relativize everything at all.
No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. But a lot of other
absolute
people.
Sense of truth also. He just thinks that biblical and, for that matter, halachic teachings don't try to harmonize themselves into one coherent, consistent teaching. And I think that that's one of the great contributions, by the way, of 20th century scholarship and 19th century scholarship before that. Just asking the question is the right question, which is, why are there so many contradictions in Kohelet or in the rest of the Torah too? In other words, the Torah Hashem could have easily written it in one smooth, coherent way, but didn't. So that's the question that needs to be asked. And so trying to fix the contradictions is important. I don't want to take away from that at all. I'm certainly not dismissing Ibn Ezra's role as perhaps the greatest Pashtan of all time. It's certainly one of the top three. Nobody has had more of an impact than he, Rashi, Ramban. I mean, there are very few people who fit into that top category. But on this particular issue, because he's trying to harmonize in Kohelet, I think he does miss the fundamental question, which isn't his fault. I don't think it's an anti-Semitism thing. Nobody was asking this question in the 12th century. I don't care what country you lived in. Why are there so many contradictions? They were all asking the question of, oh no, there are contradictions. What do we do? So we have the benefit of 800 more years of scholarship, which gives us, which is helpful. And that has nothing to do with, you're right, historical context does always matter, but it's more than that. It's simply the history of ideas. The Rabbi Soloveitchik lived at a time when people were asking that question, and therefore he could say that because it was in the air. He didn't make this up on his own. So you're absolutely right about that.
No, I didn't mean, of course, he's got great moral authority. What I meant was there are people that are not as great as him who had very similar views on paper. I must say that Ibn Ezra's in my view, his main goal was to prevent the Karaites, who were a real political threat. It wasn't just that they were very good at Tanakh, they were a political threat in Spain. Therefore, he put the Beth Din of the time on a pedestal. And some of it looks a bit like, even if they're not good at grammar, you still have to believe them on halakha. His main aim was to safeguard the community. I think that is what is so amazing, because he could have just become like Rashbam. Everything is pshat in Rashbam's way, or he could have gone to the other way. But he wanted the cohesion of a community at a time of huge problems, which I don't think have been duplicated in exactly the same way in other countries, especially the USA, in my opinion. I mean, not as knowledgeable as you. I know there are problems, of course, UK as well. Anyway, it's great. Thank you so much. Thank you for letting me speak as well. And thank you for saying that Ibn Ezra was great. You'd be surprised how many people who are Orthodox don't think Ibn Ezra was great, including modern Orthodox. So, thank you very much indeed.
Alas, they're missing out. All right. Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Okay. So on that happy note, then, I will thank you all and thank the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals for sponsoring the shiur. What I want to try to do before signing off is, I wish this thing is exactly in my way. That's my problem. All right. In the meantime, let me do stop share. Hold on. That's what I can do. Hold on. Now, I just want to send that file. Here you go. So for those who want a printout of, it's currently in use. It's not in use. There. Let's try it again. Okay, so now anybody who wants the source sheets that we were using, you should have it in your thing, so you may print it up, of course, and enjoy. Thank you so much for participating in this, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great day.